everybody. Welcome back to the Geek Warning Podcast, brought to you by the Escape Collective. I'm James Huang here in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm joined by Dave Rome in Sydney, Australia. Hi, Dave.
Hello.
And we're also joined by Ronan McLaughlin in Ireland. Hi, Ronan.
Hi, James.
Ronan, I feel like we're maybe at risk of losing you to a Formula One gig at some point soon. So how was your trip to COTA?
Yeah, if there's any Formula One teams listening, you know how to find me. Well, you probably don't, but it was pretty good. Yeah, it was a long time since I was in the States, so it was nice to get back that side of the Atlantic, and it was nice to finally attend a Formula One race. Having been a lifelong Formula One fan and not been to one, so that was a nice weekend. Yeah,
excellent. Your ear still ringing?
Yeah, but not from the Formula One cars, unfortunately. Those days are kind of gone. But from the Porsche Cup, some sort of Porsche 911 race that was on beforehand, that was closer to the Formula One of old.
And also from your own screaming in joy.
Yes, and also from Queen and Tiesto, which I was not expecting at the weekend, but was an added bonus.
Fun. I dare say that's going to be a weekend you're not going to forget anytime soon. Dave, I'm kind of curious here. So the show notes here for us have me being, they're listed as being oddly insistent for me to ask you about your latest tool purchase. So what is the big surprise here?
I just wanted you to ask me, so I can get a jealous reaction. But I have been using a Remco electric workstand the last week.
Oh, hey, how about that?
Yeah. So, got my hands on I believe it's slightly pre-production, so I still need to figure out what changes between production and pre-production. But yeah, I've been watching it go up and down for the last week. It's been quite amusing. So,
have you been just attaching weights to it to see how much it can hold?
I've just been trying to find progressively heavier e-bikes and then watching it do its thing. And I've become remarkably lazy within the last week of having it, to the point where I now wonder how I was lifting e-bikes so high before. So yeah, I'm becoming an e-biker in every sense of the way. Like, bikes are getting harder to pedal, bikes getting harder to lift. Anyway,
your belly's getting bigger.
No comment.
Well, Dave, I want to say that I actually found a chain tool specifically that I know you don't have, that you might want, that is completely irrational for you to have, like 100%.
Oh, is it the one that Abbey Bike Tools has for making their Decade chain tools?
No, it's from Shimano, actually.
Oh,
but apparently you can actually buy the the pin installation tool that they use at the factory with an air gun.
That's cool.
Yeah. It's like $1,100 US though, and obviously very, very niche application.
James, but, you have a responsibility not to tell Dave about things like this.
The thing is,
send me a link, James.
I know
send me a link.
It doesn't matter if I mention it or not, because Dave is going to find this sort of thing at some point anyway. Yeah. This was on a Facebook post that I saw, and someone actually mentioned Dave, and he was going to find it at some point anyway, and he is going to find some reason to try and own it.
Yeah, when I did the factory tour of Abbey Bike Tools, they were kind of hinting at that the Decade that they do is a very good chain tool, but what they use to make the Decade is even better, and that I should be getting such a hydraulic press to size chains. I did consider it, but there are other things that I could use more readily before such a thing. So,
I thought you were going to say there are limits.
Yeah, food and mortgage payments and that sort of thing.
Ronan, I don't think there are limits. I think there's higher priorities, like a lathe or a mill or a larger workshop to put them all in.
I was going to say, Dave, even if someone gave you a lathe and a mill, where would you put them?
I don't have a lathe because I don't have the room. So otherwise I would have figured out how to buy one by now. So anyway.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we will stand by to see how much further Dave will be depleting his own bank account in the near future. But in the meantime, we've got some cool new tech news to talk about today. We've got some new bikes from Merida, Polygon, and Focus. Campagnolo's got some new road wheels, and parent company of Wiggle and Chain Reaction Cycles, two big, huge online retailers. They're suddenly in a world of trouble after a pretty sudden 150 million euro funding line that they had basically evaporated. We're also going to talk about whether road bikes should maybe be a lot more compliant than they are currently. We've got a fun new geek warning segment that we're going to try out today that may or may not result in some yelling amongst our panel here. We'll see. And we'll wrap up with our usual PSA, and one that I think should be particularly timely given the shortening days for those of you in the Northern Hemisphere. First, though, we've got a couple of items for the corrections corner this week. I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, but we were talking about those new kind of prototype road shifters from Ingrid Components. And we were talking about how they had lights built into them. And it turns out they are not lights. Dave, They're not lights.
What are they?
There is some sort of fitting. If you look closely, they have a Shimano cassette spline built into the outer diameter of them, so it's just
they're spare cassette holders.
Maybe I don't know, but it's some sort of mechanical fitting. It is unfortunately not a light.
They're socket holders for your cassette tools.
Yes, maybe you can plug your Crombie in there.
Oh. Do we know what they are?
Actually,
we don't know what they are.
I don't know what they are. It looks like just some sort of way that they use that spline pattern in their rear derailleur too to attach the pulley wheels on. So it might just be some design feature that they use in the construction of that shifter. I don't really know. Might be a way for them to add some color. That's an option too, I wonder. But either way, it is not a light, which is kind of a bummer because there were all sorts of options that you could have there for like making some sort of face and whatever. But anyway, not a light.
Maybe there's still options to add like a bell to the front or similar, but if it's just a hatch to service the shifter, I'll be fine with it.
Okay. Dave, you've got something for Corrections Corner too, I believe. Do you not?
Well, less of a Corrections Corner, but a friend of the podcast, Dave Muzz in Sydney, he was listening and he was surprised that neither you, James, nor I could explain the DT Swiss wheel lineup nomenclature. So in terms of the E versus the ER versus blah 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 blah, and he quite smugly sent me a document that explains it. So I thought I would do just that. Apparently it did used to be simpler. The numbers like the 1400, 1600, 1800, they did used to correspond to the weights of the wheels. DT Swiss don't do that anymore because of all the different wheel diameters and axle options and various other reasons. So the wheel set did get more complicated, but basically the letters, so you've got, say, ER, 3 letters is a high-end carbon rim, 2 letters is a high-end aluminium rim, and 1 letter is the entry-level aluminium rim. So that would be like the pinned rim. And then the numbers correspond to the hub. So you've got 1100, 1200 is like the 180 hub. 1400, 1500 is a 240 hub. 1600, 1700 is a 350 hub. And then the 1800, 1900 wheels is the 370 hub. And then spline, when that refers to like the type of spokes. So die cut, spline, classic. And then you got the random numbers at the end, like DB equals disc brake, or they'll add like the rim depth at the end there. So not great for explaining on a podcast, but now you know.
I was going to say I think, or at least my takeaway from the DT segment that we took out of the podcast before that was that in researching all the wrong wheels, I at least finally understood the DT naming mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still confusing for the exact reasons that the listeners will be all too aware of, having just listened to you read out what you just read out.
I'm looking at the official document in front of me and I'm still confused. But
I'm a little confused from what you read out, though. That my understanding was that the die cut and the spline referred to effectively the way the hub hides the spokes versus the sort of exposed nature of the spokes on the lower end wheels versus the high. Anyway, we're getting confusing again, but
no, it is. It's the hub. It's the hub lacing pattern basically. So it's like die cut and spline. So spline is straight pull spokes. Die cut equals T head spokes, and classic equals J bend spokes.
Oh, I think you just lost me by that point.
But yeah, the main one there is the letters for me. So the 3 letters is carbon, 2 letters high end alloy, 1 letter low end alloy.
I'll give you one more to add to the collection there.
Yeah,
collection there. So the 3 letters.
Yeah, and
you've got 2 different carbon rims. You've got the ARC and the ERC. And you may have mentioned this already, but I didn't hear it. So ARC is aero road and ERC is endurance road, presumably carbon.
Yep.
Did you mention that?
I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
There's a further explanation.
Yeah, Dave didn't actually mention what the particular letters meant.
Because that's a mystery still.
Well, if
what's an still
listening, if anyone's still listening to this podcast, if you haven't shut it off by now, maybe we should just go ahead and dive into some of the other stuff here because I'm lost again now.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to have weekly corrections corners explaining GT Swiss's wheel lineups.
Oh man! All right, Dave. Dave, what do we have going on from Merida and Polygon for new bikes here? Because you've got a couple here to talk about that sound pretty interesting.
Yeah, so 2 new, well-priced alloy and carbon optioned gravel bikes from both Polygon and Merida. The Merida we spoke about a few weeks ago when Mohoric won the gravel world championships on what looked to be a new Silex, and that bike becomes official now. So carbon alloy options, very, very tall stack heights, which explains why Mohoric seemed to have sized down quite a bit on his. It's got internal cable routing through the headset. Yay. Room for 700 by 45 millimeter tires. Fender mounts. It's got a front derailleur mount if you so wish. And they've slackened the headship angle to 69.5 degrees, which, overall it looks kind of like almost like a Canyon Grizzle-esque kind of bike, a bit more adventure-y. It looks good. And being Merida, you can't have it if you're in the USA, but in other markets, it represents a good value option.
Yeah, because Merida is kind of like Giant in the sense that they make their own bikes. So I would imagine, I believe Merida makes bikes for other brands as well. And I would imagine that like Giant, they have some agreements in place that keep them from completely undercutting others. But their bikes usually are good value.
Yep. So the unofficial story there is that they have a decent number of shares in Specialized as a company, and the agreement there is that while Specialized is holds its position in the US market, that Merida will stay out and not create more competition for them. That's why you don't find Merida in the US. But another fun fact of Merida, which was true as of at least 3 years ago, and I hope is still true, and I'm not spreading misinformation, but they're aluminium manufacturing specialists. So they don't actually manufacture carbon bikes, which I hope is still true. But that was certainly the case. So there you go. So anyone that says the Specialized tarmac is just a Merida is not correct.
Interesting. So that makes me wonder who's making the carbon bikes for Merida then.
Yeah, various contract manufacturers.
Okay then. Yeah. All right. What about this Polygon then?
Yeah. So the Polygon, even crazier value, generally speaking, because Polygon is typically in most markets sold consumer direct. Tambora. So it's a kind of a flip chippable gravel bike. It's Polygon's first carbon gravel bike, and you've got geo adjust flip chips front and back. So there's one in the chainstay, there's one in the fork, kind of a bit like what we've seen with Rondo in the past, or say 51 has the Assassin, which has a similar thing going on as well. So to change the wheels, you do need to start swapping brake mounts as well if you want to swap between, say, a road wheel and a big gravel wheel. So it's not the sort of thing that you'd do 5 minutes before a ride. It's probably more a slightly set and forget kind of thing. But there's room up to a 700 by 45 mil tire again, and Prices start from US $1,800 for the carbon version, and a rival Axis bike is US $3,000, which is pretty impressive, again, for a carbon bike. Probably what stands out most to me here is that it looks to have been beaten with the same ugly stick as Bianchi's gravel bike.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at a picture of it right now, and it's not really the most elegant looking thing. No. And the other thing, it does have a ton of mounts, which I think from a practicality standpoint is certainly fantastic. But I am just wondering if whoever runs the Bicycle Pubes Instagram account, if you're listening to this, we've got a candidate for you.
Yeah, I was kind of humoring myself yesterday by trying to work out how much it would cost to outfit the Polygon Tambora with prototypo bolts. I got up to like a couple of $100 and I was just like, never mind. So
it's it looks to me like after you've spent a large amount of time figuring out exactly which flip chip setting you want to land on or settle on, you then have to work your way through all the different mounts and decide exactly where you want your bottles and bags and all
so
the
many options
and options.
Yeah.
Could be a long time before you get riding this bike after you've bought
which of the 4 spots on the down tube should you put your bottle cage? Yeah. So it's I don't know. It's great value bike. It looks to have a lot going for it. Some of the geometry that it offers are fairly smart. The stack does seem very tall though, so I mean that might be a bit limiting for some. But yeah, I mean, just I saw one in person yesterday, and value aside, it doesn't appeal to me given the weird shapes going on there. So yeah,
it's. Yeah, I'm sorry, Polygon. This is not a pretty bike.
No, it is not. So,
Ronan, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say it's perhaps, looking at it, a main part of the aesthetic there is just that kink in the top tube, and presumably part of that is just a function of such high stack at the front, and you.
Yeah, I believe so. What I was told is the kink in the top tube was a design choice to make it resemble the mountain bikes in Polygon's lineup. Like it's kind of a design cue of Polygon's mountain bikes. So, but then they, that doesn't explain some of the other weird kinks in the bike.
No, there's obviously other ways you could do it as well. Yes. But I think when you've got that much stack, you have to account for that somewhere when you're going to get sloping to the seat tube.
Yeah. So, and then some of the other weird bends and stuff are the result of flip chips in the chainstays, for example, as to why they've dropped the chainstay right at the dropout. But even still, it's I don't know. Bianchi's not the gravel bike I would have copied.
Well, I guess something that does look quite a bit more elegant to me, at least anyway. Campagnolo's got some new wheels. Ronan, you looked into these. What do we have here?
Yeah, so last year they unveiled the Hyperon Ultra, and Campagnolo have now unveiled the Hyperon, which is, well, they've said the Hyperon Ultra sort of sits alongside the Bora Ultra WTO as their premium flagship wheel sets. And these new Hyperons sit alongside the Bora WTO, the 33, the 45, and the 60mm rims as their sort of, I don't think mid-range is the right term, but certainly lower than that. Second tier, yes, that's probably the word I'm looking for. Specifically, they are 37mm deep rims, 21mm internal. They haven't actually said in the press release, but I believe it's a 27mm external rim width because it is the same rim as used in the Hyperon Ultra. The main differences are alloy hubs versus the carbon hubs in the Ultras, and you're also going to miss out on Campagnolo's Cult ceramic Ultra whatever bearings they are, but yeah, they're 1,340 grams, so effectively only 100 grams heavier than the Ultras, but they save you something like 800 pounds if I remember correctly versus the Ultras. So it'll be up to the listener to decide if that 100 grams in the ceramic bearings is worth all that extra cash. But they're certainly by no means a cheap wheel set because they are still £2,300 or $2,800
in the US. Is the rim still using that kind of straight out of the mold gloss finish?
Yes,
Oh,
it
that's
is.
nice.
Yeah, so you're still and the key takeaway for you two will be external nipples, which is another thing we covered in the DT Swiss conversation that we removed from the podcast. But external nipples versus hidden nipples on the ultras.
Okay.
And are they still doing the thing where you don't have to apply tubeless tape to run these things tubeless?
I'm going to say yes while I'm double checking, but I think that's pretty much standard on Campag wheels at this point, isn't it? It has been for a while.
As someone who is generally a fan of tubeless for a lot of applications, maybe I'm kind of on the fence for the road, but I'm certainly a big fan of rims that don't require tape.
Mm-hmm.
So, until you need to relace them.
Yeah. When was the last? But I'm with you on that one, Dave. But realistically, when was the last time you had to relace a wheel?
I'd like to say yesterday, but it has been a few years.
Okay, so I agree with you in concept, but from a more realistic standpoint, I just don't know how big of a deal that is, really.
Yeah, but no, it is definitely a much more enjoyable tubeless experience, having to never have to deal with tubeless tape, because tubeless tape does wear out. So it's a reoccurring thing when you have a tubeless wheel that is taped.
Yeah, and I feel like you get a kind of a more consistent tire fitment too, because tubeless tape can have different thicknesses, and depending on who you go with, if you have to reapply it or whatever, and like you got to make sure you get the exact right width and so on and so forth. But if you don't need to have tubeless tape at all, then that tire bed's a lot more consistent.
Yeah.
Well, moving on to some not so great business news in the bike industry. So I think most of the people who are listening to this podcast will be familiar with those kind of online retail giants, Wiggle and Chain Reaction Cycles. They both fall under the corporate umbrella of Signa Sports United. And I am definitely going to be tripping up here on some of the business terms here, but essentially, my understanding is they essentially had access to a 150 million euro equity line, essentially, that was supposed to be running through, I believe, 2025, I think, maybe 2024, I can't remember, but for some extended period into the future. And that suddenly disappeared not too long ago. And Wiggle has now been forced to go into what they call self-administration, which is pretty similar to bankruptcy here in the US, except it's going to be administered internally and not by an external party.
Yeah. Similar to like a Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Essentially, yeah. But it gets worse. So Signa Sports US, which also handled stuff like, they also had some in-house brands like New Proof and Vitas, that sort of thing. But the US division of Signa Sports US, they shut down very, very, very suddenly. My understanding is they only had a couple days notice. There was basically no package or anything for employees, from what I hear. It wasn't good. And from what I understand, unfortunately, Signa Sports US, from what I understand, was doing quite well by all accounts. And essentially the takeaway here is that Wiggle and Chain Reaction are in some pretty serious trouble. You could argue that they're maybe one of the first dominoes to fall in what is hopefully not going to be a bigger cascade of issues in the bike industry right now, given the post-pandemic fallout. But this is one that we're going to be watching pretty closely because it's kind of a big one.
Yeah, unfortunately, it can't not have a domino effect on the UK industry. They're just such dominant sellers in the UK industry, and historically they're used as often a global outlet for UK distributors and UK brands to clear out excess stock, which we know many of them have at the moment. So, yeah, unfortunately, it definitely does come at a bad time for the industry, and I think many others in the UK industry will feel this. And I think the other flow-on effect here is that this company also owns quite a large distribution network of its own brands, and has Hotlines, I believe, is their own distributor. So, yeah, there's going to be a lot of other brands that are impacted by this because the UK is a pretty significant market to suddenly lose like this. So, not great.
Yeah, and to be clear, it wasn't just this 150 million euro equity line that disappeared. That was that kind of precipitated things. They had been going downhill for a little while now. They posted some pretty big losses last year, for example. Brexit most certainly did not treat them well at all. So things were not looking great already for Wiggle in particular. And this is obviously really, really bad. So it kind of remains to be seen if they will be able to reorganize somehow. But we've heard from a whole bunch of Escape Collective members talking about what their experiences have been like ordering product from Wiggle over the past couple of years. And it certainly sounds like the customer service experience has been going pretty sharply downhill over the last couple of years. So, and pricing certainly is not as competitive as it used to be. So, yeah, I mean, as much as those online retailers really did not do good things for independent retailers worldwide, I would say, it's still always unfortunate to hear of something like this happening, in the sense that there are going to be an awful lot of people who are likely to lose their jobs.
Yep, for sure.
And we probably shouldn't get into rumors, but one of the rumors is that Mike Ashley, who UK listeners may be aware of, he used to be the owner of Newcastle Football Club, and he is still the owner, I believe, of the Frasers Group, which owns the likes of DW Sports and Evans Cycles and a few others that not exactly spring to mind right now, but he's rumored to be interested if CRC or Wiggle comes up for sale. He's a potential buyer, which, I mean, maybe it's from the Newcastle United days, but he's not exactly a favorite figure in the UK business scene, put it that way.
Interesting. Yeah. For me, like, I mean, I kind of have I wouldn't say a personal connection, but I used to certainly order from Chain Reaction Cycles quite a bit, maybe 8 to 10 years ago, and used to, I knew they were a big thorn in the side of the Australian bike industry, because they were selling huge amounts. And I know Australia was a very, very critical market to that business at one point. And various things happened that kind of eroded their success. Like Australia changed its policy on imports and brought in GST for anyone selling over, I think it was $80,000 of goods a year into the country. So all of a sudden GST was applied, and then pretty similar timing, both Shimano and SRAM brought in global pricing strategies and global distribution policies that basically meant Chain Reaction Cycles and Wiggle couldn't sell Shimano and SRAM components outside of its UK market. And I think stuff like that has probably really worn on them over the years. As they took on a lot of investment right around that time when they were selling globally and being this big dominant global player. And since then, they've had to refocus on almost focusing on their own house brands and clothing, and really trying to be dominant there. And it's not the same market as being able to sell everything to do with a bike. So yeah, certainly a harder market than it used to be.
It's not the same market, but like brands like Prime and Vitus that I'd be aware of, they've come a long way, and it's obviously very worrying times for anybody who works at Vitus. North America is obviously, and they only just moved into North America like less than a year ago. So yeah, but for customers who currently have Vitus bikes, I'm sure they have a lot of question marks on that at the moment also. Yeah,
and Nuke Proof and DHB and Prime Wheels that you mentioned, like there's some really good brands there that they created effectively and that they own, and it'd be a real shame if those were to disappear. So yeah, fingers crossed these brands can find a new home or find new funding to continue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about how those brands operate and how they're, like the R&D and marketing, that sort of thing. I would have to imagine all of that stuff was pretty heavily intertwined. But even if the company is not really able to reorganize and they need to sell off pieces of it, is it even the sort of thing where a brand like Nuke Proof or Vitus could even be sold off at this point, given how ingrained they are into that whole corporate structure? I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
But I'll admit I haven't ridden either bikes from either one of those brands, but from what I understand, they were pretty good. Certainly very good value. People seem quite happy with them. And it definitely would be a shame if they went away.
Yep. Anyway, one to watch. I mean, this issue is not going to resolve itself overnight, so we'll surely report on it again.
Well, in somewhat more uplifting news, I guess from the tech perspective, one last new bike that we're going to talk about is this new Focus Izalco Max from that German brand. Focus is part of the Pond conglomerate. It also includes brands like Cervelo, Santa Cruz, Cannondale. They have just announced this new Izalco Max. I think it's fair for us to call it like a semi-aero all-rounder, I guess. It's a road racing bike, comes with most of the usual claims. It's got truncated airfoil shaping. Focus says it saves like 6.5 watts or something at 45 an hour, and I guess that translates to about an hour, or translates to about a minute 45 at over 45k. An hour would be really impressive.
Yeah.
Compared to the previous version, Focus is also saying it's about 15% stiffer at the BB, not quite 10% stiffer at the head tube. Weight's about what you'd expect for a bike like this. There's two versions. The higher end one is supposedly about 865 grams. I presume that's for a medium. And then the second tier one comes in at about 1050. What I find particularly interesting about this whole thing is that Focus is quite open about the idea that this new Izalco Max is less comfortable than before by a fairly significant margin, at least for the frame itself. They're saying something like 48% or something. Which kind of leads me into what I want to talk about for this week's On Our Minds and Over the Heads of Our Families segment, because previous episode, we talked about Lauf recently announcing a road bike that was all about compliance. They're making a big deal about that. And I just got back from visiting a smaller custom carbon builder, Argonaut Cycles, up in Bend, Oregon. And that's a brand that has always put a huge emphasis on ride quality and comfort. And what I'm curious about is maybe why we're seeing such divergent approaches here, because to me anyway, I kind of feel like compliance is generally a good thing, even on a high performance road bike. So why would you want less of it? So I've heard from companies on occasion every now and then saying that like professional racers in particular seem to like a stiffer riding bike, which is interesting considering that we've spent an awful lot of time over the last couple of years talking about lower tire pressures and wider tires and getting more tire grip and ride quality and lower rolling resistance and that sort of thing. So like, is it kind of like a road feel and precision sort of thing? Ronan, can you help me answer this one here?
I am continually amazed by the amount of people who I still speak to that say when something feels harsher, it feels faster. And how that is better than something that maybe rides more comfy, but doesn't feel as fast as a result, even though it may actually, if you were to test the two setups, the comfier, slower feeling one may actually be the faster.
Yeah.
So I don't think that message or that theory has got through to everybody, and especially to the pros. I think a harsher riding bike, we still associate that with going faster. And Dave wants to get in here, but I've got an example that I experienced just this week that can prove that. So I'm going to let Dave speak first.
I was just going to say, quite a few years ago, Factor launched, or relaunched its brand, and I was at Tour Down Under, and they had a bunch of the One, which is like their sprinter's bike with the dual down tube. And I went for a ride along the Adelaide beaches, and Baden Cook was on the ride. And I was remarking to him, I'm like, wow, I'm actually really impressed by this bike because it's actually more comfortable than visually it looked, and that I had expected that such a aero-focused sprinter's bike would be, and that's really great. And his response was immediately, oh yeah, we're fixing that. We're going to get rid of all that comfort. We're going to make it as stiff as it can be because that's what you want out of a sprinter's bike. And I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't, that's not what I was, suggesting here, but okay. So yeah, I think there's definitely, as you say, James, there's that element that certainly the racers and more traditional sprinters consider like a excessively stiff bike to that immediate snap of response to equate to speed. And I do question whether that's actually any truth to that. But Ronan?
Yeah, it reminds me of the latest Trek Madone. The launch around that track were making a lot of noise about the compliance and the comfort that they've built into that bike. And I sort of asked the engineers, I can't remember exactly how it came up, but the one point that sticks out in my mind is their theory, if I remember correctly, was that, getting to a finish line fresher means that you're better able to get to the finish line first. But the big challenge is, how do you actually measure that? How do you prove that it is more comfortable, even if it is more compliant? Does does that mean it's going to be more comfortable? Where does the compliance have to be? And as such, my takeaway from that conversation was that actually the marketing around making a comfier, more compliant, and thus better bike for the rider because the rider's less fatigued is much more difficult than, first of all, weight, because that's, we know that's incredibly easy to market if a bike is lighter than the previous version, job done. And then aerodynamics is somewhere in between, in that a bike can be faster, it can be wind tunnel tested, and you can almost test it. There are stories of tricks being done in the wind tunnel to make even slower bikes look faster, and it all depends on the way you test it. But the point is, you can make a bike more appealing by demonstrating that it is more aerodynamic. It's very difficult to make it more appealing based on comfort, because there isn't really a metric around that you can easily give.
Yeah. The one thing I keep coming back to, and this is something Josh Portner often hits on, is that they can now model for race outcomes and for speeds. They have the model for rolling resistance and aerodynamics and weight and how that all factors into the end result, say up Mount Ventoux or on any given stage, and they can get within seconds of the actual outcome. The model does not account for stiffness, doesn't come into it. So, and that for me is quite telling that it's clearly not enough of a performance metric to affect the outcomes of the mathematic model.
Or is it not enough of a performance metric, or is it the sort of thing that it's just very difficult to model?
Perhaps. But surely the model would be flawed and coming up with differences between reality and modeling if it were a big enough factor.
My when I've heard that Josh said that a few times as well, and obviously the model being so close to the actual result proves that there is accuracy there. But the question mark for me is that the model also can't account for cornering and descending and those things where actually stiffness can play a major role. So I can see both sides of that argument.
I guess for me, I mean, I've definitely been more and more of a proponent of kind of more compliant, softer riding bikes as I advance in age, particularly. But it's not even just that. I've always, I guess I've been steadily coming to this conclusion that those softer riding bikes also have a big advantage in terms of traction. And like coming back to Baden Cook's comments about sprinting, I mean, who am I to question his experience sprinting as far as a stiff bike versus a soft bike? But Ronan, I mentioned in the show right at the beginning that you were just in Austin at the F1 race, and Formula One cars, as far as automobiles go, are pretty much the tippy top of the technological pyramid, right? And those those tracks are, I mean, they're not glass smooth, but they're pretty darn smooth. And suspension is still a very, very, very big element to how well those things perform. And granted that you got 4 wheels instead of 2. Obviously, we're not talking about the same sorts of vehicles, but even on motorcycles, for example, like you would never consider having a motorcycle that doesn't have suspension. And then even if you look at kart racing, those things don't have proper suspension as far as moving parts go, but flex and compliance is very much a part of how those frames are engineered. Because otherwise, if they're just rigid as a board, you have no traction.
Yeah, I mean, Austin's probably a bad example for that, and there's a whole lot of controversy around
okay, yes, but, relatively speaking.
But how those cars ride the curbs, but also perform under braking and accelerating is actually one of the key components that goes into lap time, and that all comes down to compliance and stiffness and getting the right balance. And obviously, a balance in the bike is also what we're looking for. Too far in either direction is going to be a problem. Too stiff isn't going to be nice descending either, and too compliant, I'm convinced there will start being performance issues at some point.
Too compliant, you potentially introduce things like speed wobble and and obviously in a sprint you don't want your wheels going in separate planes to each other. So there absolutely is this medium balance.
Yes, I mean I certainly when you get to the point where you start to push the limitations of how much, I guess, directional flex you can tune into a carbon structure. But I posed the question to a couple of carbon engineers at different bike companies over the last couple of days about this, and the consensus that I get is that it seems like brands certainly could introduce more compliance into lightweight road racing frames, but right now they don't, mainly because the market doesn't seem to have an appetite for it, and there is this perception that a softer riding bike also equates to a slower or lower performance bike.
There is something about getting on a harsh, stiff bike that if you want to roll out your driveway and have a good time from the second you push on the pedals, you need a stiff, harsh bike to have that good time. If you want a bike that's maybe actually faster, it maybe doesn't feel all that good. You don't get the same initial response or acceleration sensation that you do from a very stiff bike.
But again, I mean, I think it's important to not conflate things like bottom bracket and head tube stiffness with like a vertical compliance. So if you are able to have a frame that maintains that level of BB and head tube stiffness, but also give you a lot more ride comfort, then it's just a little perplexing to me why that wouldn't be a desirable thing. Because I remember I went to the Canyon Ultimate launch last year, I guess it was. I can't remember exactly now. And for their top end CFR model, they have a special seat post just for that. It's significantly lighter than the ones that they include in the other models. It's got a zero offset because it's apparently what their pro riders want. They want to sit a little bit further forward on the bikes. But they also got feedback from their pro riders that they wanted a stiffer ride. So that seat post, I can't remember what the description was that they said, but it was basically like kind of ridiculously stiff. Like that seat post just doesn't bend. Which again, I mean, having tested that version of that bike and then the entry level version of that Ultimate, I mean, the seat post on the entry level one is definitely more comfortable.
And I think that maybe gets to why it might not be all that enticing for some brands to offer more compliance, is because it either requires a different seat post, like the example you've just given, James, or it requires, different carbon layups or different weaves in different areas and a whole lot more complexity, and complexity equals cost. So I think perhaps that's sometimes part of the challenge there. The example I was going to give earlier was I've got the lightweight Obermeyer Evos in for review at the moment. And I also have Colnago V4 RS, which comes equipped with MV 3.4 SES wheels, if I remember the name correctly. And obviously
slumming it,
28 mil tires. Yeah. 28 mil tires, tubeless, all the modern quirks, and you can obviously run those much lower pressure. But then switching to the lightweights, such a narrow rim, at least I believe I had to move to a narrower tire. And with a narrower tire, then if I'm going to follow some of the online calculators in terms of pressure and that, I end up at much, much higher tire pressures. So a stiffer wheel with a narrower tire and higher pressures than even the MVs can hold because they're hookless, absolutely transformed the sensation of riding that Colnago. And I'm not even going to say it was in a good or a bad way, but I can tell you by the time I got home after a 90-minute ride on Irish roads, it was not a nice sensation. But 10 years ago when I was racing full time, I distinctively remember going from Dolan bikes in 2012, which had the RS in those days, like this is over a decade ago, was a very stiff bike, had a similar ride feeling, had similar sized tires. I was probably running higher pressures, but on the same roads, and hands and rear end were numb by the time we came home. And then a year later, when we moved to the Vitus, the first of the modern after Chain Reaction took over that brand, and it was a funny thing because when I was asked about that bike back then, I being a pro, or not pro, but being a sponsored rider, you couldn't really say bad things about the bike. So I used to just say that it was the most comfortable bike I'd ever ridden, which was true, but it was not what I was looking for in those days. And that was kind of what I was reminded of when I moved to the lightweight with narrow tires this week, just how harsh and how stiff a ride I used to think was much faster and much better and much more desirable, and how much I hated it 10 years later.
Yeah, this is an area where cross-country mountain biking went through huge development over the last 5-ish years, is that they actually started doing time testing, legitimate time testing with power and heart rate and other metrics, and working out the stress on the body, and they figured out that a heavier dual suspension is almost always faster and more efficient off-road versus, the hardtail that always felt faster because you're out of control. So yeah, it's I feel like the road space is still learning this lesson, and unfortunately I think in some cases it's kind of repeating the lessons. It wasn't 10 years ago Cancellara was predominantly often riding like a Demane and doing a lot of seated attacks on that quite a comfortable bike, and I feel like we're kind of slowly coming back full circle to riders picking a more comfortable bike. So anyway,
I published an article last week on a couple of UCI rules that I dreamt up that I thought might help in terms of sustainability in the cycling industry. And one of the things that I'd come across researching that article were flax fibers and biofibers, so forth. And actually they're dampening properties that actually could be quite valuable in terms of, improved ride comfort and also in terms of improved traction and other things. And chatting to BComp, the Swiss company who are behind the Amplitech, if I remember the name correctly, it's a flax fiber that they produce. That material is used quite a lot in motorsports for its dampening properties. Now, Stefan and Chris at BMC told me that they had looked into flax as long ago as far back as a decade ago, and the stiffness just wasn't there at that time. So there is obviously a trade-off there, and the big trade-off is the extra weight that these flax fibers add to a structure. But that dampening properties, if that's something that can be realized in future with the right stiffness ratios, that surely, or that potentially could be the next step. And according to BComp, they are working with cycling manufacturers at the moment. And if I remember off the top of my head, it was like seat posts, handlebars, saddles, rims, basically all the contact points and touch points that can influence comfort.
Yeah. But yeah, fundamentally it comes back to the industry needs to get over trying to sell forever lighter product and forever stiffer product that feels good out of the driveway and actually isn't better. And then once that message gets across and once consumers actually start realizing that highest stiffness to weight ratio product isn't actually the best riding bike, then at that point, I think we'll actually see brands being able to successfully implement such flax fibers and other materials. James?
I blame Tour Magazine.
Yeah, and that keeps coming back to my mind as 10 years ago, Tour Magazine was ranking bikes purely on stiffness to weight ratio. And that encouraged brands like Canyon to create bikes that literally were as stiff as possible and as light as possible without necessarily considering how well they rode. And yeah, thankfully, I think we're past those days, but I still see a few brands still playing that game. And yeah, hopefully we're getting to a point where they realize that how a bike rides is more important than how a bike tests.
Not exactly known for his sprinting prowess, but I remember Dan Martin saying, if a bike is too stiff and you're sprinting out of the saddle, then your back wheel can be skipping all over the place, and actually you end up sprinting slower. Regardless of his sprinting abilities, still a valid point worth considering. And if you do have a bike that you think is too stiff or too harsh or whatever, tire pressure and lower tire pressure are still your friends.
Yeah, he may not have been a sprinter, but
he could attack fast, uphill, downhill, all sorts. So he knows a thing or two about it. Yeah,
I was going to say he may not have been known as a sprinter, but his power output is still way higher than any amateur out there. Anyway, all right. Well, let's wrap up that part. I guess we'll see where this goes in the years to come. I do think this is going to be something that we're also going to be keeping an eye on. But Dave, you had an idea for a new Geek Warning segment that sounded pretty intriguing, actually. What have you concocted here? What are you calling it?
I'm calling it Pick One. Basically we pick a category and then each of us have to share which product within that category would be the one we would choose if we could only have one product. We're tech editors, so we're kind of used to having more than one of anything and having the luxury of not having to use the same product over and over and over again. But I'm saying if you could only have one, which one would it be? So yeah, I think we'll see how this goes. But each week we might try pick a different product category and debate or share. I don't know if it needs to be a debate, But yeah, Ronan?
Aerometers up first.
Aerometers up first.
I think, just to be clear, just to set some ground rules right off the bat here, I think there are a couple of categories that we're just going to go ahead and take off the table right away.
Yeah, for Aerometers, Ronan, you can pick one for James and I.
Okay. yes. That segment will be called Suggest One.
Yeah.
So we're not going to do Aerometers.
Yeah.
And Dave, I'm really, really leaning toward not letting you pick any sort of tool as a category.
Why not?
It just doesn't seem fair.
Oh.
I think if you want to bring a tool up, you have to buy it that week and then mention it in the opening segment of the
we don't need to give him any more motivation.
He's already got it. James, we can't control.
We will figure this out as we go, but I think it's going to be pretty fun. Dave, what is the first category for this week? Since you get to pick, since you concocted this whole thing.
I was thinking, given you guys are heading into winter in your northern hemisphere, do some rear daylight running lights, or aka rear lights.
I definitely have some thoughts on this one. Ronan, do you have a favorite that you run? Do you use one, actually, first of all?
I do, and it's maybe not the most practical example, but it's one of the few things that comes on every ride. And I would, if it wasn't charged, I'd probably decide to ride the turbo instead.
Whoa!
And that is the Varia RCT 715, the Varia radar with the light and camera built into it. So yeah, that's a no-brainer for me.
Yeah, wow. I would have thought you'd
interesting
be picking something smaller and more aero. That's a surprise.
You have this misconception about me, Dave.
Yeah.
That's
look at you putting self-preservation ahead of speed. Wow.
Well, I think the way that Ronan's looking at it, that light is putting out so much wattage in terms of light output that he's comparing it to kind of like the little ion engines that they use in space. So it's actually sort of very, very microscopically pushing him forward.
Yeah.
I think that's the way that he's looking at it.
Now there, if we've got a listener who can invent something like that. But yeah, it is entirely on a safety level. And that one of the things I like most about it is that you can actually just scroll down from the top of your Garmin screen, swipe across a couple of times, and then you can select the light mode function. And I just like it to flash at the start of every ride. I wish it would remember, and maybe it does, but I haven't really bothered to figure that out yet. But I wish it would remember my preferred setting from the last time I rode and just take that up from the start. Nevertheless, it's easy to do, and having the camera built in there, again, if something happens, you can easily save files. It's always recording. You can set it to only record on radar activity, and then just having the radar there and a little bleep from the head unit and a little display in the head unit, giving me an idea of where vehicles are. I'm a big believer. We shouldn't have to do these things to ride safely on the road, obviously, but nevertheless, just knowing and being aware that a vehicle is approaching from the rear, I find that looking behind me and making eye contact, a human connection with the driver, has reduced the amount of close passes and scary moments I've had by an immeasurable amount. And as such, it might not be right, but I'm willing to do it.
Dave, what about you?
I am not on the Varia train, just mainly because I don't always ride with a head unit, and I don't like the distraction of it. I'm generally more. I'd never listen to music while I ride, so I feel like I'm generally pretty well attuned to what's coming up behind me, and I'm sort of the person in the group that tends to call out car back a minute before everyone else does. So certainly where I ride, the roads are either got a shoulder or you've got pretty quiet roads that you can hear the cars coming for quite a while. So so for me, I tend to stick with the more traditional rear lights. So as of late, I've been quite liking the Lezyne strip drive, specifically the 300 lumen Pro version, which is a slightly bigger one. Just a nice easy rubber strap that can move from bike to bike. Nothing too fancy with the mount. Simple.
It's very bright.
Off. Very, very bright. I know it's being seen. Easy to charge. And it's been reliable for me to date. So can't complain. And it's also not at a price point that, you know, if it were to get lost or get rained on, I'd be too upset about it. You know, it's quite a affordable price. So yeah, I've been quite impressed by that light.
Interesting, because I think not too long ago, at the old place, I think several of us had picked the Bontrager Flare as our favorite.
Yep, still use it,
and I do still like that rear light a lot.
Yeah, I still use it from time to time.
Yeah, I do like that one a lot, mainly for its flashing pattern. But it does seem like some other lights that have come out more recently maybe do a better job of kind of being more visible from various angles. I think like they kind of like that Lazine light that you were talking about. Like it's kind of big and like you can see it from a pretty wide angle of view.
Yeah, I think they claim 270 degree visibility, which I think is probably a little optimistic, but let's call it 220.
Sure, still pretty good though.
Yeah.
So I guess my choice, I'm going to kind of split the difference a little bit because I do, Dave, I will say that I held your opinion not too long ago as far as thinking that I was pretty good at hearing cars coming up from behind. But particularly with where I am, there's definitely a lot more electric cars on the road than there were not too long ago. And when I'm on gravel, the tires, my own tires are making a lot more noise than they used to. And I found not too long ago that especially when you add wind noise into the equation, that I definitely wasn't hearing things coming up as well as I thought I was. And then I started using a Garmin Varia 515, the one without the camera. Actually, maybe the one I have is a 510. I can't remember. But anyway, the Varia model that does not have the camera. And it's been interesting how, while it doesn't actually like provide any physical protection, I agree with Ronan that there is a certain peace of mind in just knowing what's coming up behind. But one thing that Ronan didn't mention that I did find really cool about that Varia is that when it does detect that a car is approaching from behind, it changes the flash pattern, which to me is sort of akin to you sort of like turning around and like jumping up and down, waving your arms around and say, hey, I'm here. It's kind of it's nice to have that sort of automatic feature where you presumably get a little bit more. Yeah, you sort of just almost kind of like force a little bit more awareness or visibility at that point. So I've been a pretty big fan of running that on my road bikes, or I guess whenever I'm out on road or gravel. And then otherwise, if I have to ride my mountain bike somewhere to go to a trailhead, I still like that flare as long as it fits. But yeah, I definitely don't run the Varia on the mountain bike, mainly just because it's too big. But otherwise, the flare is still pretty high on my list.
There you go.
Yeah.
Lots of good options.
The only thing I hadn't considered actually with my whole philosophy on turning around and making eye contact with the driver was the driverless cars that I spotted, or the autonomous vehicles that I spotted in Austin. I'm not sure how you make a human connection with those things. They're, yes, very weird. But anyway, that's another problem for another day.
I'm waiting for someone to come up with a very, very oversized rear daytime running light that is shaped like a stop sign. That could be the solution there.
I mean, there's been some very cool lights concepts over the years which have kind of failed to reach mainstream popularity, but ones that, you know, flash the equivalent of stop signs down onto the ground to give you like a light barrier around you. I mean, I know these things are out there and about. For me, it comes back to effectiveness, and for me, a light pointing back still to me is the most effective during the day. So
I had it must be close to a decade ago also, but I had a Night Rider at one point that shot beams onto the road that was supposed to be like
the lasers.
I never, got to ask a driver if it made any difference to them or not, but I did a lot of commuting at that time. But
yeah. Speaking of commuting, I mean, now we're going on a tangent, but James, here they are. Redshift. I'd completely forgotten the brand name. Their pedals, because I had their pedals on my e-bike for my e-commuter bike for a while. Those make a huge difference. Like just having the biomotion with like a flashing light. They're rechargeable LEDs that magnetically slip into front and back of the pedals. they're very clever. They, depending on the orientation of the pedal, it switches the light between a white light or a red light. It's very, very smart tech. But yeah, I was astonished at how much more room I was being given compared to usual with running those pedals.
Yeah, well, I run those on my Urban Aero cargo bike, actually. And I think one thing that's really nice about those, one, they're quite bright, like pretty impressively so, I think. And then on that Urban Aero, what's interesting is those front lights are not visible from the front, mainly because the box is blocking the visibility from the front. But what I what I think anyway, what I'm theorizing is at night, what those forward lights are doing actually is sort of lighting up the bike.
Yep.
And it's just sort of making the whole thing a little bit more visible. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm quite a fan of those as well. I've been using those for quite a long time. I don't love that there's 4 things that you have to charge. It does at least include a separate 4-bank USB charger, which is at least it makes that a lot more convenient. But I love the concept of it for sure.
Yeah, because it sets your width, right? Like that's kind of the flaw of most lights, is that they're centrally placed. So the motorist doesn't really see the width of you, and they can see the light, but they can still get pretty close to you unintentionally. Whereas those pedals basically set the outer perimeter of you as a human, and they then give that outer space. They give space from where those lights are. So it's a cool product. Unfortunately, it's not really attainable on a clipless system. And
well, they do make a clipless system now, just not really for the road.
It's not something you'd use on a performance bike.
Not really. No. Quite big, quite heavy, that sort of thing. Still pretty neat though. I like those. So all this discussion of rear lights, however, does conveniently lead us into our PSA for the week, because as I know that we've mentioned this on a previous episode, but I'm going to go ahead and repeat it today just because I think it's important. But one thing I still see regularly out on the roads, particularly as you said, Dave, we're losing daylight here in the Northern Hemisphere pretty quickly. If you are running a daytime running light, please check that it's actually visible in daylight, because I can't tell you how often I come up to a cyclist on the road, whether I'm on the bike or in a car, and I basically don't even notice until I'm practically on top of them that they have a rear flasher on there. And I'm sure those people who are running those, you intentionally put those things on there because you presumably are trying to increase your envelope of safety there. But if you're sticking something on there that no one's going to be able to see, particularly in bright daylight, then that thing is just not doing its job. And if anything, it's providing a false sense of security. So I think I mentioned this before, but one thing I often advise to people, if you're curious if that thing's visible, set it out just in front of your house or just stick it somewhere, and then walk kind of far away, like, maybe several blocks or something, and just see if you can still see it, see how bright it is. And I think in a lot of cases, you'd be shocked at how invisible those things become with not very much distance.
I might just drop an extra PSA this week because it's related, and it's also related to my pick one, which was the Varia. And then if out there you do have a Varia, or if you're considering one, you should also consider the my Bike Traffic Connect IQ app for your Garmin head unit, because it just, you don't really have to do anything. You just set it up on your Garmin, and then it actually will count the amount of vehicles passing you. It will collect what speed they were doing as they passed you, correlate that with your speed, plot it all on a map of your ride. It does a heck of a lot of stuff that I find fascinating sometimes. You do have to, it's a wee bit awkward, you have to download a FAT file, upload it to the My Bike Traffic website then to actually see all this data. It's not automated as of yet, but it is a very nice feature if you've already got the Varia.
The 5-year-old in me wants to know whether it counts the colors of the car.
I think that's coming in a future firmware upgrade. Not sure. No, I don't believe so. Dave, sorry to spoil that one for you.
That would be very convenient if it did do that, because my daughter and I have this. We've had this running game for a while now, where we get points for pointing out yellow cars that are out on the road. And I will say that she is absolutely crushing me at the moment. And if that app did provide the capability to count yellow cars, that would be very, very, very helpful for me. But yes, unfortunately, it sounds like that's not going to be helpful. Oh well.
I wonder if you can import the fit file into AI or something, and it can take it from the RCT video and calculate the colors and that.
That sounds like far, far too much work, Ronan. Way too much work.
Yeah, it's more like something that's definitely going to happen at some point than something we're going to have to do. But yeah, I mean, we're kind of getting away from it a bit now. But it's either called My Bike Traffic or My Bike Radar Traffic or something. It's like a Connect IQ app. And yeah, the fascinating thing I find is just the vehicle count, and days that are busier, you can see objectively how much busier they are. The one thing I wish it could do, which it actually doesn't, is sort of give you a close pass or wide pass sort of rating or score. But yeah, the not so nice feature that it includes, which is ultimately probably its strongest point, is the passing speed of the vehicle. And I've had scenarios where a driver has really frightened me or scared me or whatever, and I've gone back that evening, downloaded the file, looked at it. You can see as the driver is like 120, 130 meters away, they're doing say 100 kilometers per hour within the speed limit, and by the time they get within 40, 15, 10, 5, and right past me, they actually have started accelerating, which is, not a nice thing to see, but further proof of the sort of assumption I made at the time that that person has done something hateful on purpose rather than through negligence or just not seeing me or something. They've actually seen me and they've actually accelerated towards me as they've actually passed far too closely.
Doesn't exactly help with the anxiety when riding on the road.
It does not. No, it does not.
Well,
sorry, that was a bit of a.
We're going to go ahead and end the show on a good old downer there, Ronan. Thanks very much.
Got anything else in that run sheet we could pull out just to end this?
Well, anyway,
on a brighter note.
I hope you did enjoy that new segment. Pick one. I think we're going to have some fun with that. And hopefully you found that PSA useful, even if it was maybe a little bit repetitive. A couple of things I just want to remind you of as we close out this week's episode of Geek Warning. First of all, thanks to all of our members, because you are making this happen. So I'm not going to browbeat you about becoming a member if you're not. We'll save that for another day. One thing I do want to request to everyone, however, is if you have not yet left us a review and rating on iTunes, to please do that. And we also have some new podcasts that are tech related that I just want to remind everyone of. Ronan's got his own podcast called The Performance Process, which goes into quite a lot of detail of as far as essentially extracting a lot more speed out of either your gear or your body, and some of the stuff that he's been talking about with others has been pretty interesting there. And we also have, I know we've been talking about this for a couple weeks now, but we do have special members only editions of Geek Warning coming up. We're going to be kicking off specifically with a few Ask a Wrench episodes, so you definitely don't want to miss those. And those, as I mentioned, are going to be members only. So yeah, we've got some pretty good stuff coming up. So make sure you sign up to Escape Collective if you're not already a member, so you don't miss out on anything. And with that, we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.